Hi everyone, this is Dr. Rich and I want to talk to you about the Valsalva maneuver. This is pretty complicated. I know that it didn't work as well as it might have in lab for many of you. I think we had some measurement error and I think we didn't complete a full Valsalva maneuver. So what I'd like to do is to sort of talk you through this experiment. The Valsalva maneuver is when a person forcefully expires or exhales against a closed glottis. So it's quite different than holding your breath, because there are changes in intrathoracic pressure that affect venous return. That in turn affects cardiac output. That will affect arterial pressure because of your baroreceptors in the aortic sinus. And then heart rate will change because of influences on the cardioexcellatory center. So I have a figure here that we're recording, and what you can see is this man lifting 2 dumbbells. And what happens here, we can see there's a blue vena cava, and it's compressed when he does the lifting motion and holds his breath. So what happens? This is a little bit interesting. First I'm going to walk you through it, and then I'm going to show you on this graph that's shown in blue. So the first thing that happens when we compress the vena cava is some blood is forced back towards the heart. What that means is we'll have a short-lived but transient increase in venous return. That increase in venous return does everything that you know about. It's going to stretch the right and left atrium. When that happens, we of course stretch those nodal cells. That's going to cause an increase in heart rate. It's also true that we increase preload because we've stretched the heart. When you increase preload, the heart contracts more forcefully. So that's going to increase the amount of blood that's ejected or increase the stroke volume. So EDV increased, then then stroke volume will increase. I'm sorry, I always have to work through this in my head. So we've pushed more blood out of the heart, but this only happens for maybe 5 or 3 heartbeats. Once that's done, that vena cava remains compressed if you're maintaining this compression. And when that happens, we decrease venous return. And if you put less blood into the heart, that's less EDV. Therefore, we're going to have less stroke volume. Less in, less out. We're decreasing preload. That is another way of saying we decrease cardiac output because stroke volume is decreased. Now, those baroreceptors in the aortic sinus are going to immediately know that less blood is coming into the aorta because there'll be less stretch. When that happens, blood pressure is dropped, and they will send signals to the cardioexcellatory center. And really, the signals are a decreased action potential frequency from the baroreceptors that's going to increase the cardioexcellatory activity, and that'll increase heart rate, and it will increase peripheral resistance. Now, blood pressure doesn't rise above normal levels, it just comes back a little bit. So what you can see in the graph is blood pressure drops and then begins to come back up, and that's because of sympathetic stimulation. Now, I want to go to the next slide so we can really look at the, so we can really look at these graphs. Let's look at the one on the left first because it's pretty straightforward. What you can see is mean aortic pressure is going along. You know that should be something like 100 millimeters of mercury. Now we hold our breath and we bear down, maybe while we're lifting a weight. We get a transient increase, so a short-lived increase in mean aortic pressure. That's because venous return is increased, followed by a decrease in aortic pressure. Now, if we held that Valsalva for longer, that decreased aortic pressure would stay down. It would start to rise back to normal because of sympathetic tone, but it will never supersede normal. It shouldn't. We also see that heart rate really increases dramatically, and I think most of you measured that. This colored graph shows a dot for every single heartbeat. And what they measure here, it's really a calculated number, and it's the pulse pressure. So it's systolic minus diastolic. And you can see that that pulse pressure increases for a few beats, and then it drops like a stone as venous return decreases. And then it begins to slowly rise as peripheral resistance goes up and heart rate goes up. But notice it doesn't come back to normal values, it still stays low. Now, when you release that breath hold, we get a little bit of funny business, and I'm going to ignore that. And what we see is a humongous increase in pulse pressure. That's because when you release the vena cava, right, we've released our breath. Now all of a sudden the vena cava is bigger and blood shoots back to the heart. That's going to increase preload, and that's going to give you a harder contraction. That's number one. Number two, it increases EDV, therefore stroke volume increases. Number three, we have suddenly stretched those SA nodal cells, and that's going to give you an increase in heart rate. And number four, we have the atrial reflex, and that means you stretch that right atrium, and we get some sympathetic activity, and we increase contractility. All of those things happen. That means all of these things combine to increase cardiac output, but peripheral resistance is still high, because the sympathetic nervous system is really clamped down. So we increase cardiac output, peripheral resistance is high, and blood pressure skyrockets. That's exactly what you see. And quite honestly, that's why the Valsalva maneuver can be dangerous. Now I know there's a great deal of maybe there's some controversy, not a great deal. And that has to do with should you or shouldn't you hold your breath while you lift weights. I don't want to get into that. You know, that's kind of an opinion piece. I do think that this rebound in pressure on the breath release can have some danger. That's number one. Number two, when understanding Valsalva for strength training, really we're in phase one of the Valsalva. We're quite early, because when you do the weightlifting, usually each lift is pretty short-lived. There's another thing that we didn't talk about, and that's when you lift a heavy weight, your muscles get bigger, and they're going to compress not only your veins, they're going to compress arteries. And what that means is really outside of what's going on in the thoracic region, we're going to get a rise in blood pressure. So Valsalva during strength training is a little bit complex, but what I can tell you is a prolonged Valsalva for sure follows this graph I've told you. And what we mainly focus on is this compression of the vena cava and then the release. And the timing is quite important. So you can consider phase one, or this really early part of the Valsalva, and then the later phase that requires 10 or 20 seconds of this breath hold and bearing down. Okay, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.